It's UFC 209 week, which we assumed we would lead off with. We assumed I would lead off to ask how you're doing. But, Brett, we're going to skip right over these pleasantries because sometimes timing is fortuitous, and we have breaking news right into the ESPN newsroom right before we got on the air today.
Yep.
We got to jump right into these headlines, Brett. So however you are doing in your personal life, we're going to have to put this on the back burner. Michael, hit me with it.
It's time for 5 rounds. Headlines.
Number 1, UFC President Dana White on SportsCenter today. We're recording this on Wednesday of Fight Week. And Brett Okamoto, GSP, we know he's back, but now we know who he's going to face. UFC middleweight champion Michael Bisping. We do not have a date. We do not have a site. But we have a match. And, Brett, that also means we're going to have a little bit of controversy for what this means for the division, something that we talked about last week. Your reaction to this news?
I don't like it. And anybody who's been listening to this podcast is probably not surprised to hear me say that. I mean, I understand what the UFC is doing, and in some ways I wonder if they really had a choice. You know, but GSP had a lot of leverage during these latest negotiations. You know, we heard about Freddie Roach talking to the UFC, and Nick Khan, super agent over creative over at CAA, who represents George St. Pierre. You know, they had a lot of leverage because they know that the UFC needs headliners, they need draws, they need to sell pay-per-views right now, and they know that GSP does that. So GSP doesn't have to come back. He said that a million times, and I wonder how real that is because fighters got to fight sometimes, and he's only 35. I know that he wants to compete again, but at the end of the day, he held a lot of the keys, and so if he's telling them, you know, this is how much I want to get paid, and this is who I want to fight, I almost wonder in some ways how much of a choice the UFC had in terms of, well, if we want GSP back, he's only coming back for Michael Bisping. We better give him Michael Bisping. You know,
you think it's a GSP leverage thing where my gut reaction is, hey, welcome to the NWO. This is the new UFC under the WME administration. Yep. We're making fights that will sell. We're not too worried about what good old Yoel Romero or Jacare thinks about that. You know, we're making fights that sell. Brett, to that point, this is a fight that'll sell. I mean, this is you got hella intrigue, if I can say that, right?
Well, here's the conversation that I think you and I should have, because everybody who follows this sport, who's listening to this podcast, understands what's going on here. So here's the question. How does this play out long term? Is this good or bad for the sport that we know and love? You know, clearly WME IMG is invested in the short term payouts. That's what they're going to lean towards. I think that's pretty clear that we can say that right now. And so what's the casualty of this? I guess the casualty is to a degree the legitimacy of the sport, you know, because you're basically just thumbing your nose at the rankings, and also of course individually it's Yoel Romero who is the casualty of this. Does that matter? Does it matter in the overall health of the sport that they are now doing this, consistently going with these short-term ideas over the long-term benefit? What is your take on that,
Yes, it does
Brian?
matter, Brett, because it's a slow bastardization of the sport into some of the sins that befell boxing. It really is. Now, boxing is a different situation. A lot of cooks in that kitchen, everybody out for themselves. This does make a mockery of the title. It does make a mockery of the rankings, because what you sort of said is when you look at the future, and I think a lot of people are going to favor GSP in this fight, and that's a separate conversation, but if he's to win this, Brett, I don't think that he suddenly then he's just going to go, okay, who's next in line? Yoel, Jacare, sure. If GSP wins this and now has the middleweight championship, wouldn't you think that they'd be more likely to go the way of an Anderson Silva fight or a Nick Diaz fight than they ever would rewarding anybody in the rankings? So when you make a decision like this, it not only adds on to the decisions that you've made in the last few months, including the creation of that featherweight title in the women's division at 208, you know, interim title at lightweight with Conor Away, you just continue to open some wounds that if you don't have a plan to fix those wounds, Brett, then it becomes the wild, wild west. And when there's no law, Brett, when there's no law, things start to break down.
It is becoming a situation in which it does remind me of boxing, and that the super fight, the names involved are what matters, and that's always what's mattered in terms of selling pay-per-views in this sport. But underlying that is that, you know, the best fight the best in this sport, and I think that's what's helped this sport, you know, continue to take strides where boxing has fallen. And because when you run out of those big matchups, you know, you still need that sort of competitive everyday storyline going to keep the hardcores invested and to just keep the train moving to a certain degree. It keeps people invested. It seems like these storylines just recycle themselves because there are guys who are trying to get to the top. Whereas in boxing, it's all about just these who's fight, like all of a sudden this big fight lands on your lap and then you become invested in just that one single fight. And I was hoping that that's not what the UFC was going to turn into, that they would treat these case by case and do these big fights, but they would still keep to what's been their core over the years, and that is developing the sport and rewarding to a certain extent, the best in the sport. But now you look at some of the cuts that they've made and some of the contracts that they haven't renewed, and letting guys go over to Bellator, and it does seem like, at least for right now, they are sure following a little bit more of that boxing model where it's all about the glorified one big fight at the top and the rest is not all that important.
And Brett, there's a crazy guy in this podcast who once made a bold prediction that this WME era in 2017, in their first full year, that they'd start taking tricks out of the Bellator playbook. Not 50-year-old versus 50-year-old, but storyline, fun fight above anything else. And now you look at Michael Bisping, a guy who, luck is not the right word, but a guy who surprisingly fell into the title late in his 30s. His title run now consists of fighting a 46-year-old man and fighting a welterweight.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what to say to that, Brian. I don't like it. I don't like what's happening to my sport of mixed martial arts. I want to see the best fight the best.
And you know how it's going to get fixed, Brett? Here's how it's going to get fixed, and it's not a fix. Yoel Romero versus Jacare 2 for the interim UFC middleweight champion. And you know this, man. You do, Brett. You do know this.
Let's go to number 2. This is depressing.
Number 2. The New York State Athletic Commission, Brett, has denied Holly Holm's appeal following her UFC 208 loss to Germaine de Randamie for the inaugural UFC Featherweight Championship. Brett, I don't think a lot of people are going to care. No. She may have a case, but I think here's the real question here for me, Brett. Do a little bit of damage control. Let's say you're guiding Holly's career. Still got a lot of star power, but that's 3 straight L's. 4 if you count this NYSAC decision. How do you fix this? What do you do next in her career? Where are we going with this?
Well, I mean, there's 2 ways of thinking in my mind, and that is, one, exactly what they're doing. They have Germaine de Randamie, who clearly wants to fight them again, for obvious reasons. She doesn't want to fight Chris Cyborg. So they know that, and so they're going to try and use that to their advantage, because in their head, they're saying to themselves, man, we had her. We may have lost that fight 48-47 if, that's what the judges say, but in our minds, we were starting to figure it out. And I think Holly Holm would go into a rematch pretty confident that she knows the recipe to defeat Germaine. But here's the problem with that trying to play that card, and I can't blame them for doing that, but I just don't think that's even a card, because I don't find it realistic that Chris Cyborg has been cleared. She's available to fight for the title, and yet they're going to have a title fight without her. There's just absolutely no way the UFC is going to do that. So I think
unless Brett, this.
What,
you can't
Brian?
justify Holly Holm in a title fight right now unless it's a rematch and you play up the controversy angle, because she's got 3 straight defeats.
They can't. They can't do it. They'll get ripped to shreds.
So the only way you get her back in a title fight is do the rematch and play the controversial angle. And the reason why you do that is because what's the fight that UFC really wants, Brett? They want Cyborg Holly Holm. It sells. It gives you feels. But you can't do that fight unless Holly redeems herself by winning the title, because no one really cares about Cyborg.
No. You asked me, the question was, do damage control, and I assumed that you meant maybe her team. Maybe you were talking about the UFC on how to bring her back. But if I'm her, man, I gauge her a little bit and say, can you fight Chris? Are you willing to do it? If we can get you the right money, if I can go in there and say, no one cares about this featherweight division. They don't care about Germaine de Randamie. As a champion, I can get you Holly Holm, but you got to promise me this amount of money. This is going to, and then I go to Holly and I make sure that she wants that fight. I do make sure that she wants that fight. No, because Holly comes out and throws Germaine under the bus and says, clearly the champion does not want to fight Chris Cyborg. She doesn't want it. She wants no part of it. This is not a real champion. I beat her. The only reason she won was because she hit me after the bell. She's a dirty champion who does not want to defend her belt. I will take the fight that nobody wants. That's the fight that everybody wants to see anyway. Chris Cyborg, you've been running your mouth way too long. You've been too heavy for this division. Well, guess what? I am going to fight you anyway. I don't care if there's a title on the line, because the title doesn't mean anything, clearly, because the champion doesn't want to defend it. I am going to go after Chris Cyborg right now. Yeah. Holly Holm comes out with that statement. Who cares about the belt? I mean, we just had a conversation about how nobody cares about belts anymore. It's all about super fights. If Holly even wants that fight just a little bit, as her manager, I say go get it, because we can build this thing up like crazy. The UFC needs big fights, but it all comes down to whether or not Holly Holm truly wants that fight, and I think based on evidence, she kind of doesn't.
That's some spiteful booking. I know you hate pro wrestling, but that's some heel turn spiteful booking there. I like where you're going with there, Brett.
You taught me well.
Number 3,